So now we're going to look at the mechanobiology in articular cartilage. Now, articular cartilage is very unique compared to some of the other structures involved, and we'll talk about that. Structurally, when we look at articular cartilage, a couple things to note. It's avascular, does not have a blood supply. It's aneural, so it does not have a great nerve supply. It's alymphatic, meaning it also does not have lymphatic. So comparatively speaking, in regards to a lot of the other tissue, it is very different, and it's actually also sparsely populated with cells, so it doesn't have a huge amount of cells in it. So a lot of the remodeling as far as the actual extracellular matrix comes from the chondrocyte. So the chondrocyte is your primary cell within cartilage. Now, kind of a unique thing about cartilage is it does respond. It requires stress, much like the other tissue, to remain healthy, but it's a little more sensitive to how much. So we need some loading for cartilage to be healthy, but overloading leads to degeneration. So when we look at cartilage, cartilage responds well to what we call pulsatile or dynamic loads, meaning like intermittent loading is very good for cartilage, whereas just static compressive loading tends to cause cartilage to break down. Also, when you tend to look at cartilage throughout the body, when you tend to look at a lot of the articular cartilage, again, how strong it is in different areas is going to be basically based upon how much force it tends to have to deal with. So an example is at the patellofemoral joint, particularly the medial part of it, that cartilage tends to be very soft because it doesn't take on as much of a load as, say, the actual cartilage in the actual knee joint or the tibiofemoral joint itself. So again, it will depend on the strength of it will depend on the area that it's at. And again, the key is pulsatile dynamic loading will do that. So when we look at kind of how cartilage deals with force and stress, so collagen 4, so we talked about collagen 4, and proteoglycan matrix helps with the force transduction. So we said that when you have force from multiple directions, collagen 4, if you remember going back to that picture and kind of the way it's set up, it's basically designed for that. When you have, again, that dynamic loading that I talked about, so the functional dynamic loading, you basically have a lot of production of aggrecan and type 2 collagen as well. So again, type 2 collagen will also be included in the makeup of the articular cartilage, with collagen 4 being involved in the actual the force transduction, or what kind of takes on the force and stress of the cartilage. So the pericellular matrix is going to bridge the gap between the cell membrane and the extracellular matrix gap. So basically that's where, again, a lot of that force transduction is going to occur, basically where the force is going to be transmitted through. And again, the input from the integrin receptors. So remember, the integrin receptor on all these tissues is kind of the starting point for when all of these tissues get stressed in multiple ways. Again, if you have that good pulsatile loading or good dynamic loading, you're going to get the production of aggrecan and type 2 collagen. If you get static loading, okay, or a lot of abnormal compressive forces in cartilage, you're going to get inflammatory cytokines to form, and you're also going to produce degrading enzymes, which is going to break down the tissue, and then that's where you get into pathological processes like osteoarthritis. So one of those degrading enzymes or enzymes that gets produced are what's called MMP, or matrix metalloproteinase. So that would be something that would get produced in a situation where there's too much compressive loading. The flip side to that is, cartilage also doesn't do very well when you don't load it at all. Again, cartilage is meant to be loaded in different parts of the body. So if for some reason, again, a person is just inactive for whatever reason, you look at cartilage inside the tibiofemoral joint at the knee, obviously, typically, which would take on a lot of stress, would soften and atrophy and then not be as functional. Then if it would be loaded, it wouldn't be able to take that on. So again, it's sort of that, very similar to what we talked about, that balance. It's just the actual mechanisms are slightly different, because now you don't have, for instance, here you have no blood supply. Okay, so as we talked about, much of this is going to happen within the actual cells in the cartilage, because you can't get any real endocrine or hormone support for that. A lot of the endocrine process that's going to be happening here is going to be through autocrine and paracrine responses, because of the fact you don't have a very good blood supply. So here we have, if you look, so if we're looking at the knee joint here, you have a defect in the femoral condyle. So this is what would commonly happen in somebody with, again, osteoarthritis, where the articular cartilage would break down. Again, it's going to be a balance between catabolic versus anti-catabolic activity in the cartilage. So again, if you have good functional dynamic loading, pulsatile loading, that cartilage will continue to maintain itself very well, and you'll get the continued production of the extracellular matrix, the aggrecan, the type 2 collagen, which makes a lot of that up. If you don't, you get a lot of abnormal static loading, and again, the other structures around the knee will support with this as well. For instance, if somebody does not have strong muscular support around the knee, that will obviously cause a lot more force to be put through the actual joint itself. So again, it just becomes a balance of all those components that I talked about. So again, here's a situation just for your own preparation purposes. So again, all the things I talked about with the dynamic and static loading and some of the components are really what I want you to know. So your book gets into some of the other signaling processes and stuff like that. I'm not so much concerned about you being able to cite every single one of those enzymes. Obviously, talk about the ones I mentioned here, but don't get yourself too wrapped up in a lot of those other signaling cascades and stuff like that, because I'm not going to make you know those, but just make sure you could understand the primary components of the extracellular matrix that I pointed out, along with just kind of the differences in what gets produced with the the functional normal loading of the tissue versus the abnormal loading. Okay, so mechanobiology in bone. So again, bone is going to be managed through different types of hormones and cells. So first of all, we have our different cells that basically regulate the remodeling of bone. So we have three primary cells there. We have our osteoblasts, we have our osteoclasts, and we have our osteocytes. So our osteoblasts are the cells known for building up bone. The osteoclasts are the cells that break down bone, and the osteocytes are your basic bone cell that will kind of differentiate depending upon, again, the stresses and everything that get produced. So again, as I've mentioned this even in talking about the chapter with exercise, again, much like many other tissues in remodeling, the bones are constantly remodeling based upon stresses that are placed upon them. So there's also various calcicotropic hormones that regulate this, that actually allow cortical bone to be able to either increase or decrease in mass while you're doing this. So just every day, you just think about everyday basic physical things that you do, walking, standing, things like that, are all basically signals for bone to remodel. So very important, the role of mechanotransduction in just general bone health. So we had talked about in class about how, for instance, like individuals that go into space, the danger there and for them, and what they really have to focus on when they are not on a mission. They have to really work on their bone health, because obviously if they're gone for prolonged periods of time, that could be impactful for them. We had mentioned how, and I mentioned how in the textbook it talks about how the increase in cortical bone in the dominant arm and elite tennis players. And again, part of that is because of just the stresses. The bone is basically remodeling in response to that stress. So the idea here is to increase the thickness in the cortical bone. So the cortical bone is the hard bone, as opposed to the trabecular bone, which is the spongy bone. But the cortical bone is, it makes up the harder part of the bone. And again, if you have immobility or you're not active, that's going to cause a decrease in that, because basically the body just simply says, well, we don't need that much bone mass in order to survive. So the bone tends to break down a little bit more. And again, you could also have a problem with the remodeling process if by chance too much stress. And essentially what happens there is, in the case of like a stress fracture, the bone breaks down because of activity. However, because the person either doesn't rest enough, keeps adding volume to whatever physical activity they're doing, the bone continues to break down more and more. So again, ideally we're looking for that optimal amount of stress. So the stress, when as it's applied to bone, so bone's certainly not as deformable as other types of other types of tissue. So there's not a whole lot of elasticity to bone, so it does not experience as much strain in response to the stress. So meaning like it doesn't deform a whole lot. Okay, so like think of that in comparison to like a muscle or a ligament. The muscle and ligament stretches, deforms quite a bit. It does deform, but you do have deformation in bone. It's just not a whole lot. Now, when you do have that deformation in bone, again, here we talk about, again, the integrin receptor is responsible for kind of getting activated in response to a certain amount of strain as it's experiencing the stress. And again, that stress of the fluid flow through the canaliculi, and we'll talk about the canaliculi and the lacunae and where they're at in the bone on the next slide. But it basically activates that integrin and leads to collagen 1 and collagen 3 formation, and again, collagen 1 being the more predominant one, but also the fibronectin and the formation of that focal adhesion complex. So we talked about the importance of the focal adhesion complex and being able to regulate stress as it gets transmitted through the bone, and what role that plays. So if you don't remember that, go back and look at the earlier part of the presentation or look at your notes. But that will all allow, through these structures, for the bone to constantly remodel in a functional manner. Okay, so here we're looking at the structure of bone. So down in here you can see your two big parts of your bone. So you have your cortical bone, so that's the hard bone that we typically think about, I guess, when you think about bone. And here's your trabecular bone, which is the spongy bone. Okay, and that's where your bone marrow is, where your red blood cell production takes place. If you look at the cortical bone here, you can see that you have, again, your blood vessels kind of flowing through there, because the bone needs blood supply. And here what we do is we're teasing out a section of cortical bone. So we tease this out and we look over here. We see, here's your canaliculi. So canaliculi are just these little channels, okay, that extend out into the bone. And then you have your lacunae, which are basically where your osteocytes reside. So, the canaliculi serves as an extension. So again, as bone is experiencing different levels of deformation, it basically signals to the lacunae. And again, some of those other structures, the deeper you go, again, your integrin receptors and things like that, they will all play a role in being able to maintain kind of that extracellular matrix of what the bone basically consists of. So again, collagen 1 and 2, fibronectin, and again, that the formation of the focal adhesion complex. So it basically continues to help to maintain the good structure of the bone. Okay, so again, the prominent things we tend to see in bone are those structures, the collagen 1 and 3, fibronectin. So all of those mechanical signals, if they're, again, appropriate, and again, within that, also there has to be, that kind of intermittent loading that we talked about. So again, if you take, for instance, the cross-country runner who, runs too much, doesn't allow enough rest, well, the bone just consistently breaks down. It never gets to remodel up. However, you get the person who, gives that right amount of activity, you get that breaking down, but then the bone's going to remodel in response to that. So all of that, that stress and strain that basically occurs to the structure, if you allow that to then remodel, it will actually make for a stronger bone and will assist with bone mass. Okay, so the stress is the actual force being applied. The strain, so those are two different important terms in regards to remodeling. Strain is how much deformation occurs. Okay, so if you think of a bone maybe bending slightly or shortening because of a compressive load. Again, bone doesn't do that a lot. Bones don't bend a whole lot, but in reality, they do have some slight deformation. Okay, so they're not just these hard structures that don't ever move. Granted, they don't stretch and bend and twist like, however other tissues do, but they can experience a slight amount. Obviously, if they experience too much, they just fracture and break and you have a macro trauma, and then they have to go through the healing process, which we're not looking at that. We're just kind of looking at, overall how the bones will respond to activity. A couple things, so just to summarize, then look at the learning objectives. So again, Mechanos transduction is important in tissue health, repair, and homeostasis. So again, essentially there's that optimal amount of loading, which again, if you go to a lot of the things we're currently talking about in class on the exercise component and what that means, we're looking here at the physiology behind that. So again, it's important to just general health to allow for a certain amount, but in the case of a situation where breakdown has already occurred, now how do we fix that? Okay, and look at the different ways. For instance, like the eccentric strengthening with the tendinopathies and what that means. That's essentially what we're looking at from the rehabilitation perspective. When the integrin receptor is probably one of the more important things with mechanotransduction, and they can co-activate with cytokine receptors and other receptors to produce the cell response. So they kind of work with the cell to produce the appropriate response based upon the amount of stress imparted onto the tissue. And again, all of the different structures respond to positive or positively or negatively to stress, just depending on the amount of load and how much time they're given to actually repair themselves. So kind of just see some of the slight differences, because all of these structures have very different makeups in regards to the amount of blood supply they have, the nerves, and everything else. So, and here's your learning outcomes to kind of summarize what we went through. So again, certainly go back and look over some of the pertinent structures that I talked about. So again, I'm not going to make you responsible for knowing every single cascade with all the different enzymes, but I did point out the more important ones to know and kind of how they function in the bigger picture. So I think functionally, if you know those, you can be comfortable knowing enough of the information as far as how it would apply with this topic.